Now that we've established why English orthography is so unique and the origins of it, let's move into morphology and how it influences our English orthography and spelling. So, why is morphology important to reading and spelling? A morpheme, first of all, is a linguistic entity that may be whole words, parts of words, or single phonemes. Essentially, morphemes are the components of words that carry meaning, the smallest unit of a word that can carry meaning. Knowing morphemes enhances your reading vocabulary and spelling. And we know that good readers use strategies to distinguish and remember the meanings of words that sound alike, including recognizing meaningful parts. Now, a morpheme can stand alone or it can be attached to something as a bound morpheme. We'll get into that in just a second. But the most elemental unit of a grammatical form is that it has both meaning and sound. And let's think about morphemes and how they're defined by looking at its unique morphology. Morphos is Greek for form or structure, and eme is an element of or little piece of something. So you combine those to get a form or structure that's an element or a little piece of something. And I was talking to a teacher last year, and I'd never thought of putting it to like this, but she was thinking of morph meaning change. Like she didn't say this, but this is what I thought of: the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers. So if you think of morph means to change something in form or structure, then you can think that a morpheme or morphology changes word meaning. So that's a good way to remember it. But it's the smallest unit of a word that can carry meaning. It can be categorized by language of origin and by grammatical role. So there are different categories of morphemes. First, we have free morphemes. They can stand alone as words and do not have to be combined with other morphemes. These are usually base words and that are Anglo-Saxon in origin. There are also function words. They're limited in number. They're learned early, and there's a grammatical glue of a sentence. So, walk is an example of a free morpheme. It's an action word. It's a verb, and it stands alone. But of course, we add other morphemes to change its meaning in regards to tense and grammar. These are also content words that carry the meaning of the sentence, so nouns and verbs. Whereas bound morphemes, they only work in combination with other morphemes. So you have roots, combined forms, prefixes, and suffixes, but a root word usually cannot stand alone. You have inflectional suffixes, which are closed grammatical endings that cannot change the part of speech to the word added. And then you have derivational, which mark or change the part of speech of the word added. So it changes it from a noun into a verb. All right, so let's look at morphemes by language of origin. So as we've talked about with English orthography, that language of origin influences words and its spelling. So we have the same languages that we discussed before: Anglo-Saxon, Latin, and Greek. For the Anglo-Saxon influence, you have compound words. These are adding free morphemes together. So baseball, football. Sorry, you can tell I'm Coach's wife because those were the first ones that came to mind. But they're compound words. They are grammatical categories determined by the last word. Bittersweet is an adjective with an adjective. High chair is an adjective with a noun, making it a noun. Barnyard is a noun with a noun, making it a noun. Sea kayaking is what the book has, is a noun with a verb, making it a verb. There are no rules for spelling compounds, and there's often more than one acceptable way to write a compound word. So that makes it a little bit more complicated when it comes to spelling. But again, if you know the origin and the sound phoneme grapheme correspondence, and then could take into consideration of morpheme, we usually can figure it out. So in Anglo-Saxon, these type of words that morphemes are their base words, such as neighbor, eat, heaven, sky, as that has in table 5.1 on page 121. These are words that are nouns and verbs. There are also inflectional morphemes like ed, es, carrying tense. And then they have a few prefixes and suffixes, the prefix a or be, and un, again following that one syllable type structure that we see in Anglo-Saxon words. But they're just a few prefixes and suffixes that it has in comparison to the many, probably hundreds of prefixes and suffixes that you get in Latin. So that is what Anglo-Saxon roots of morphemes. Now let's look at the Latin-based prefixes, roots, and suffixes. So Latin-based, they're content words that are built around roots. The root is, it's a vowel or long or short, but it's not schwa in roots. So the root usually is the accented part of a longer word. Roots are bound morphemes, so they are combined with prefixes or suffixes. So this would not be looking at walk and walking as a root word, but it would be looking at a root word such as agra and ang and anum, as you can see on table 5.2 on page 122 and 123. Prefixes from Latin were prepositions whose meanings have remained consistent over several millennia. So that's where the prefixes come in. Now, you have assimilated prefixes where the prefix is assimilated. They're also called chameleon prefixes. And this means that its last sound melds with the first sound of the root for the sake of, I believe I'm saying this right, euphony, or ease of pronunciation. So it's easier, for example, to say approach than approach, or suppose rather than suppose. So therefore, even though the root might be sub, or the prefix might be sub rather, it's melding to match the phonemic form, because as we learned in last week's discussion in the last chapter, that we often change sounds based on the proximity to the letter it's nearest to, the vowel or the consonant. So it's heavily influenced by markers and its surrounding phonemes and sounds. Now, finally, Greek combining forms. These are modern scientific and mathematical terms incorporated into English in the last 600 years. And so we think about science, technology, math. A lot of our words coming from those fields are Greek origins: psychoneurosis, neuropsychology, parapsychology. Those are all Greek roots, and they can combine with other bound morphemes of equal importance in flexible order. So they don't have to come at the end or at the beginning. They can change positions just depending on what you're trying to combine to make meaning. So, graphic as the root of graph, which means write or record, versus photograph, and graph is at the end of the word. So their placement changes depending on what meaning it's carrying. Now let's look at inflectional and derivational suffixes. Only derivational morphemes can change the parts of speech of the words to which they are added. Versus inflectional suffixes, these are nouns. They show possession, gender, or number. So your hers, types of pronouns, gender, alumnae, alumni, or number, wishes, crisis, that es plural. And the word is a noun. They show, in verbs, they show tense, voice, or mood. So the tense would be the past tense, ed, and talked. The voice, he was driven. Or the mood of the word, she could have been driving. And comparison, softer, softest, as the word is an adjective. Possession and degree can be expressed morphologically or syntactically through word order. So saying the boat was hers versus that was her boat, it really doesn't change the meaning of a sentence, but sometimes the changing the word order will change the syntactic structure or the sentence structure, which we'll get into a little bit later. But and you can say, oh, the boy had a lot of luck, or you could say the boy sure was lucky. That doesn't change the meaning. It's just changing the way that we're saying it. And think back to English, and when your teacher was talking about using passive voice and the to be type verbs, where you don't have to use that. That's what I think of but that's not necessarily a suffix, but how word order cannot necessarily change word meaning. Now, most inflectional suffixes are learned prior to reading and writing instruction. They're typically, they start developing around 2 years of age. So children will start marking ing and the ing, walking, running. And this is often why when we're doing therapy, action verbs or action words. Present progressive tense is one of the first things that we target in speech and language therapy because we want them to start combining those morphological forms. If you learn that one form of ing, and it exponentially increases your vocabulary because of all the verbs that you can combine it with. And I have kindergartners that I'm still working on that skill with. Now, the rules of grammatical and inflectional morphology in speech are typically mastered between 4 and 7. And that's not to say there won't be some deviations from that, such as the overgeneralization that you see when he learned it instead of he learned, with some of the way that the preschoolers and early elementary students will use these inflectional suffixes. And I'm thinking of Cecile. It says usually by 2 years of age they're doing this inflectional morphology. She's nearing that point. She's not really doing it yet naturally, but she is imitating it. So I can't wait to start hearing her produce that. And I would predict probably about 21 months when she starts doing that, because she's 18, almost 19 months now. So it's real close, and that's why I said it's by the age of 2 years. Now, why spelling past tense and plural forms is difficult. We use consistent spellings for past tense and plural inflections, even though their sounds vary depending on the phonological properties of the ending phonemes of the words to which they are added. So again, remember last week when we talked about how those phonemes that are together influence it, the voiced versus voiceless phonemes. So if you do the exercise on page 5, on page 129, exercise 5.6, you can see, for instance, talked, the ed is just pronounced the t, the flap, essentially, because the k at the end is voiceless, versus instituted, well, that's voiceless too, but it has to do with the institute ending in the e. And when you add the d, you have to say instituted, because the t and the d together, we can't say institute. It doesn't work. It doesn't work as we're trying to demonstrate that past tense vocally. So the phonology, the production of the word, highly influences the pronunciation of d, t, or the flap, or ed in our words. So then again, just to reiterate, the inflectional suffixes do not change the part of speech of the word to which they are added. The plural of wish is wishes, is still a noun. The past tense of dance is danced, it's still a verb. It's not going to change. If you change dance into dancer, that changes it from a verb into a noun. That becomes a derivational suffix because it changes the tense of speech. So let's talk about the derivational suffixes. Derivational processes are characteristic of Latin origin. Latin and Greek derived words comprise about 60% of the words used in text, text being literate text, literature, reading, and writing. So when you consider that, most of our reading and writing, most of the texts we're reading are going to have the roots in this versus the Anglo-Saxon words, which would be 40%. Words derived from Latin roots are the most common in expository text, and you'll learn more about expository text in your studies, but essentially an expository text is a text that's what Common Core is calling informational text. It's very academically related and content related, and subject specific. It's not a narrative, which a narrative is telling a story. It has characters, plot, setting, problem, solutions. And expository text is information. So Kennedy's book that she brought home today was Dolphins and Whales, I think, and that would be an example of expository text, because she's learning all about dolphins and whales, or a penguin book, or the first book she brought home was about chemical and physical changes, and this was a book that's supposed to be a first grade reading level, and on the first page you encounter the words chemical and physical, and I said, this is a little bit higher than what I would anticipate for a book at a first grade reading level, but it wasn't necessarily the syntactic structure, which again, that's next week, the sentence structure, as it was the types of vocabulary words and the information that she had to process, with it being an expository text. It was a science type text, but children are going to have to be exposed to that. Common Core is requiring it because traditionally our reading and our literature standards or curriculum have focused on those narrative type story structures, literature, literacy rather, the fiction type of text. We have to start incorporating more nonfiction. So that's what expository means, but that's why it's relevant here, because children aren't going to be used to encountering that. Children from culturally deprived backgrounds are going to have the exposure to that type of language that's used in expository text about telling the purpose of something. So we're going to have to understand the linguistic foundations of that to help our students and teachers adequately teach that to our students. So morphemic knowledge includes awareness of the grammatical function of suffixes. We need to know how the suffixes change the grammar. So just like in morphemic, the ic suffix is changing the meaning of morpheme. And a morpheme is a noun. Morphemic knowledge, morphemic is an adjective describing the type of knowledge that is used. And I was actually talking about this IC combination when we were doing hard C, soft C with my students. And I said the only words that I can think of that end in IC where they don't have the K on the end are because of a morpheme. So photographic, morphemic, mimic is because it's a morphological root. You, not necessarily following that orthographic rule of when you write, let's just take the example that's right there in morphemic, M-I-C, you'd read that as mic, and you put the K on the end for that short I sound. But in, because that's a suffix that it's adding, that's why you don't put the K, but typically you do. What did that do? There we go. All right, so morphemic knowledge includes awareness of the grammatical function of suffixes. So what happens with schwa? Why do we have schwa even existing? It may occur as a consequence of suffixation. And again, look at that use of that morpheme and suffix added to the Asian added to suffix. They are morphing. They are changing the meaning of suffix. So the consequence of suffixation. And so some derivational suffixes are neutral because they do not change the stress or vowel quality of the word they are added to. However, then you have suffixes that are non-neutral because they cause shifts in pronunciation of the base word when the suffix is added, reducing the unaccented vowels to schwa. So it uses the word as itty. Disable versus disability is the one that came to mind. Generous, generosity. Curious, curiosity. You're changing the accented vowel. And so that's changing one of your vowels into a schwa sound because you can't have more than one accent. You can have a primary accent, and you can have a secondary accent in longer multisyllabic words. But you're always going to have one vowel that takes the charge and carries the weight of the word. So it takes time because you need exposure to learn phonological pattern, to learn how to spell the vowels of unaccented syllables when they're reduced to schwa. You're just going to know it from the frequent exposure in reading. So this is not a skill you're looking to master in a second grader. This is something that is more of the upper elementary discussions about how you know when to use what letter based on the amount of exposure you had. And the book has these great examples of tupid, tupidity, tupidizable, because we should be able to pronounce that even though those are nonsense words based on our exposure. Now, when inflectional and derivational suffixes are combined, so when a derivational suffix is made plural, past, comparative, or possessive, the inflectional suffix is always added to the end of the word and does not come before any derivational suffix. In other words, derivation first, inflection last when adding inflection to a derivational morpheme. So for uncomplicate, it becomes uncomplicated. Deliverables versus deliverable. Summarizing versus summarize. You always, and that makes sense because the inflectional is not changing the meaning of the word as far as the tense. It's changing the meaning, I'm sorry, but it's not changing the tense of the word. So it's still remaining a vowel word or a noun. So suffixes with soft T-I, C-I, and S-I, these are your T-I-O-N, S-I-O-N, C-I-O-N, they're shunned words. They act as connectors that complete the syllable and link the suffixes to the base or root word. So that's why they exist, and you can, the table of 5.6 is a good example of those types of endings. So let's look at derivational complexity. That's the term that characterizes the number and types of changes that have been made in the base word or root when it's combined with other morphemes. So think about, there could be lots of endless combinations essentially that can occur with these derivations. So you have phonological changes to the base word. These phonological changes can be syllabic regrouping, so you change the accent. Differ becomes different. You have vowel alternation, in which the vowel is changed, such as sane is changed to sanity. So your A became A. You have consonant alternation, where the consonants change sounds, electric versus electricity, the hard C to the soft C. Then you have stress alternation, such as philosophy to philosophical. And that's a common result of derivational word building. You also have orthographic changes that occur by spelling rule, such as double final consonants before suffix that begins with a vowel. You have dropping the final E when the suffix begins with a vowel. And then you have changing Y to I before a suffix, as we discussed last week in the orthographic rules. Words with phonological changes are more difficult, though. The ability to generate derived forms orally preceded the ability to spell these forms. So that's why they're more difficult. The complexity of the relationship between base and derived form affected the ease of spelling. So the instructions should begin with the base words and affixes that do not involve phonological shifts or spelling changes. So we're looking at how to teach things. Enjoy, and then teach enjoyment, because that's not changing a lot of the phonological properties or the spelling. It's just adding something to the original spelling. So how do we identify a morpheme? How do we find a morpheme within a word? You're seeing morphemes all the time, but you're not necessarily parsing the words out and dissecting them to do it. I mean, just look at the word meaningful and how many morphemes are in meaningful. You have mean, you have ing, and you have full. You have 3 morphemes in the word meaningful. So you can practice this with a 3 test of morpheme identity. Can meaningful linguistic units be identified and defined? So tense markers, root words, base words. Can other words be recalled in which that morpheme seems to be used? So as full and meaningful, we have seen that in many other words. And then what is the sense of the whole word and the context in which it is used? But it's not the same thing as finding the little word in the big word. You're dissecting it based on exposure. And this is really an approach to know how to identify an unknown word. How do we figure out the morphemes in an unknown word so that we can linguistically decode it and read it and hopefully get pretty close phonologically in pronouncing it. There's a complex relationship between form and meaning. We must consider structure and meaning of the whole word before deciding whether a part is a morpheme. And we must be considering it within the context of what is happening. Morphemes represent more than spelling, they represent meaning, and we have to consider how they're carrying that meaning. So just because you see ing, that doesn't mean it's that morpheme of ing of the present progressive tense. Ing in ring doesn't mean it is ringing, as in the present progressive tense. So the knowledge of the context and how it's occurring with the relationship between form and meaning. There are limitations on morpheme productivity. The morphemes are only partially productive because they can only be added to certain words in English. Their use is confined to specific words or specific types of words. So we can add the suffix ment to enjoyment, refinement, and endearment, but not divorcement or rejectment or acceptment. So how do we distinguish between the words we can and can't add the morphemes to? So that's something we have to consider based on our knowledge and our exposure, that we wouldn't have the word enforcement. And I can see this in Kennedy. She'll add morphemes to words that don't really exist. One of my favorites right now is Tyrannonball. And it's like a combination of cannonball and torrential, maybe, or a torrent or tyrant. I mean, she's got that tyran and then ball, or she's got the tur and then combined with cannonball. And it's a word she's using to describe jumping off the bed into a pile of pillows. So it's really, it's like a cannonball, but it's not a cannonball because it's not in the pool. It's always on the ground and it's huge. That's her meaning. So she is deriving morphemes and using morphemes and producing them in combinations that don't exist. But hey, we're doing that all the time with words like selfie and whatnot. Another example I have with her was rememorize. So the combination of remember and memorize. She says, I'm having trouble rememorizing that, or I need to rememorize that. And it's one that's occurred more than once. And so she knows re means again, and she's combining essentially remember and memorize to get the word rememorize. So there are interesting combinations that only through exposure and me kind of saying, well, that's a good way of saying it, but that doesn't really, that's not really a word. We can say this instead. That's how she'll learn about the morphological combinations that are and are not allowed. So morpheme combinations do not always mean what the parts suggest. Sometimes it's not exactly what we would expect with the morpheme, but 80% of derived words do mean what the parts suggest as long as multiple meanings of the roots are considered. So if you're looking at only about 20% of derived words that don't mean what they are, the meaning that they're carrying. All right, meaning, pronunciation, and word relations. Morphological knowledge allows us to judge when words are related in meaning, even when they are pronounced differently. That one I always use is amnesia versus mnemonic. They both are related to memory, and so you have that MNE root that is relating you to memory and how you can remember and memorize that MEM combination that Kennedy was using. They're all related to memory and using that. There's the same roots. So wild, wilderness, judge, judicial, predict, predicate. These are all words that have we can recognize the morphology even though they're pronounced different when we see it spelled. Our knowledge of morphology develops as we learn to read and write and as our exposure increases. So judging the degree of word relatedness. Whether words related in meaning can be determined by the collective judgment of the community of language users. Essentially, we as English speakers are the ones judging how words are related. And semantic and phonetic similarity between words affect whether we judge them as related. It's all in a lot of it's in our perception, but you generally come to a consensus whenever you discuss it amongst literate, knowledgeable adults and linguists in these areas. All right, so individual differences in using derivational morphology. How we remember words. Words are remembered in relation to others. This is important to remember. Each word is part of a network of related meaning, and word family networks are constructed in memory by their morphological relationships. So essentially, and there's the example here in this paragraph on page 139, there's that amnesia, mnemonic, and amnesty relation that even though we might not consciously recognize that the relation to those words, we're subconsciously recognizing it because that's how our brain is grouping things. Our brain categorizes things. If you're not watching Brain Games on National Geographic, this kind of plays into that. There was a segment on, I don't want to give it away though, but there was a segment on, they ask you a color, they ask you a tool, they have you do a memory type task first, and it's like memory and word order. Then they do a color and a tool, and they can almost 9 times out of 10 predict what the person's going to say. And it's because of the type of categorization of our brain and the retrieval. I'll see if I can find that on YouTube and post it on this week, because it will be good for connection for y'all to know that our brain's a network, but just like everything else, we file it away into different compartments and cabinets. And so we're just a big network of like a spider web of connections. And you'll get this more in theory, but just again, thinking about it, it's a web or a network or however, whatever analogy you need to make of things strung together. And we have all these shortcuts to get to places. We don't just have every single word stored individually. We categorize it. And that's by morphology too, from the tremendous amount of exposure we've received that through phonological representations and morphological representations and orthographic representations in literature and in oral language. So awareness of morphemes helps us understand and remember the difference among homophones, or words that sound the same but mean different things, such as the bat that flies versus the baseball bat. Now, people with morphological awareness organize their mental dictionary so that related words are associated and are more readily retrieved. So you have them all basically in the same area of your brain. When we're teaching, we should teach words in association with morphological networks and derivatives of one root morpheme at a time, so that we can help build those pathways in the brain. That's where the explicit instruction and morphology comes into place, even at the kindergarten and preschool level. So how do we develop morphological awareness in good and poor readers? Good verbal learners are more sensitive to derivational relationships and use this knowledge more productively. Phonological awareness facilitates morphological awareness because they're both found associated with being good readers. And we know that the phonological awareness falls into the categorizing and sorting words into different parts. Adults who read well have wide networks of word families that are ready access for cross-referencing in the lexicon. And the lexicon is your total word knowledge area. All right. Children who are poor readers have difficulty applying morphological rules to unfamiliar base words. So if I gave you a nonsense word, if I told you to make it past tense, future tense, present tense, you would be able to apply your morphological knowledge to do this. And there's some good articles on this too, where they are looking for linguistic markers. A lot of things they've done with past tense when they're looking at language disordered children. Can get into that a little bit more later when you get deeper into the studies. This is the basic language science of everything. Children with specific reading and writing disorders misuse inflectional endings, especially ED, more than their peers. However, it is important to note that when you're talking about inflectional endings such as ED, this can be dialectical in nature in Southern English dialect and African American English dialect. We also drop past tense ED marking. He walked over there yesterday instead of he walked over there. And so that is an important consideration within the research terms and how they're doing this. And so there's been research in if you give them novel words, can they learn that morphological marking in children who speak non-mainstream dialects such as African American English or Southern English? And so they've been able to show some distinctions between the African American, the culturally deprived or non-mainstream English speakers versus the true language disordered children with these markers. But it's very new in the research. But if it's an area you're interested in, there's a lot to explore with that. And then there's also this concept of STEM constancy, which is reinforced by seeing words and prints. This is that children, this was in average 6th graders, by 6th grade, they noticed the parts of words that mean the same thing and the letters that spell those morphemes. So they are able to have this awareness by 6th grade if you're an average student. So teaching should focus attention on morphemes and spelling and vocabulary programs, and directly teach it, explicitly teach it, to help them be the good spellers that tend to get on their own, to help them be the good spellers that get on their own from seeing words in print. So derivational morphemes, principles, instruction. How do we teach these concepts? First, there's transparency, where you should be using the words where the meaning is transparent. Introduce morphemes in words where it's pretty easy to see what the meaning is. Per and perfume is more transparent than per and perform. Then you want to have generativity, which is introduce morphemes that are used in the most words, such as jick, tract, form, meant, itty, as it is used here, generativity and complexity. Complexity is you want to introduce derived forms that do not change pronunciation of spelling first. Helplessness is not changed with added suffixes, but indiscretion undergoes phonological and orthographic changes. So you want it to be very transparent, the least complex, and be able to generate many, many morphemes from what you're teaching them. Now, sequence of instruction, you should refer to table 5.7 because that talks about how, with the sequence you should follow when teaching these morphemes for morphological awareness. The book never refers to this as morphological awareness, but that's a term commonly being used in research now, and it's similar to phonological awareness. Phonological awareness being, again, being able to break words into individual parts and sounds and manipulate it. So morphological awareness is the same concept. You can take words and break them down into the morphological meaning and roots and understand those. So table 5.7 gives you scope and sequence for teaching morphology. It progresses from the most common to less common morphemes and from less complex to more complex. It should be taught explicitly in oral and written language. You don't just teach it in reading and writing. They should be able to use these words as well. So the goals of instruction should focus on being able to pronounce the words orally because that's going to increase their understanding and their of the word. We know receptive language vocabulary surpasses expressive language vocabulary because often we'll read it and we'll see it, but we don't use it. And when you use it, you have a stronger understanding and meaning of the word. You might be familiar with a word in text, and you might be able to even tell you what it means, but you may not be able to use it. And so in our language disordered children, an example of a lower level, for instance, there's a pair of scissors, and they'll see this picture of the scissors, and if you said point to the scissors, they could point to the scissors and when given an option of 3 or 4 pictures or even 2 pictures. But if you ask them, what is this? They'll say, you cut with it, instead of naming the word scissors. So that being able to phonologically retrieve from the memory the word that you understand the meaning of, that's when you truly have meaning and mastery of that word in your lexicon. You want them to be able to attend to sound, spelling, meaning, and etymology, or the roots of the words. Words learned in list and words need to be learned in list and in the context of connected language. So you're bringing this all together. You're not just doing it in isolation. And then words taught in relation to other words with the same morphemes. They include derived forms like photo, photographic, photograph, photographer, and photographic. So what's the primary grade instruction of morphology? How does this apply to those lower elementary kiddos that I work with? Word structure, the morpheme level, shouldn't really begin to first grade. And you can talk about it at the kindergarten level in reference to like maybe the ing forms, past tense, those types of morphemes that are changing the tense of the word, but not necessarily the word categories such as nouns and verbs. So like ing, I think is perfectly acceptable and appropriate and should be taught at the kindergarten level. But you can get deeper and more complex with it when they get to the first grade. Now, children need explicit, systematic, and direct instruction with ample practice opportunities. So direct instruction about base words, inflections, and compounds can be started in first grade. Second and third grade should continue base words with prefixes, suffixes, and suffix ending rules. So what does that look like? They can do the activity of listen for suffixes, prefixes, or base words. Put your thumb up if the word I say means more than one of something. Bunches, windows, snack, parties, picture. And these are things that we do in speech language therapy all the time. And then you can have combined single words into compound words. Combine time and tea time, spoon, park, crawler, night. So take them and make as many words combined as you can. Remove inflections and suffixes from base words. So fighting, taking away the ing, that's the word fight. So that's talking about taking away that's the meaning changing parts of those suffixes. You want to sort past tense and plural by the sounds of their endings. So you can sort this versus the z versus the s. And I know Kennedy's class is already doing this in first grade. And this is the first 9 weeks talking. They call it hard s as far as the z sound. So, talking about that in the context of the plurals. And you can bring their attention to, oh, look, pegs. Well, that s makes the z sound because the g, your voice is on. Do it. Peg, pegs. Versus if you did peck, peck, and the voice is off, pecks, pecks. So you can even start, you just tell them why things the way they are. And the ones that will get it. And the ones that don't, you keep on instructing them and bringing them up at their level. But we underestimate children too much in education to think that they don't understand it because the vocabulary seems to be above their level. If you expose them to it, if you give it to them, they can learn it. For the most part. So there's categorized inflective words by meaning. So words for things versus words that describe. Again, in kindergarten, they were doing nouns and verbs and talking about the differences between nouns and verbs. So that's sorting right there. Then you can categorize words by form. So you can talk about compound words versus contractions versus other types of words. You can identify, underline, and read words with inflections used in context. So taking a sentence and underlining the tense markers. We drifted into the center of the grassland, which stretched as far as the eye could see. And you can combine base words, prefixes, and suffixes and use the new words in those combinations. So you have a list of prefixes, a base word, a suffix, and you have them combine them. Unteach. Well, is that really a word? No, let's try this. Unplant. No, that's not really a word. Try unable. Okay, we've got a word. Unable. So let's see if we can add a suffix. Unable. Able. Well, of course not. Unabled. Past tense. Sure. Enabling. Enabling. I don't think that's a word. And then unabler. No, that's definitely not a word. But if we change the un to in, we have an enabler. And so, playing with those combinations and seeing what words we get. So that's the lower elementary grades, essentially K through 3rd. 4th through 8th grade, what should you be doing? Students could successfully analyze 250 new printed words per year through morphological analysis with proper instruction, is what the research has found. So that's a tremendous amount of words. That leads us to children learning several hundred to 5,000 new words per year, with the most new words being learned from print. And that's when you talk about reading, you shift from learning to read to reading to learn. And you learn your vocabulary through your literature exposure. And because of the nature of our instruction. The greatest benefit from vocabulary and spelling instruction may be gained from exploring aspects of word structure that can be generalized or used independently when students encounter new words. So derived words with affixes are more numerous among less common content words. And so the content words, that expository text that are more specific to the content, the derived words have affixes, are more numerous there. So the emphasis should be on learning real words with derivations and connotations in the word meaning. So how it carries meaning in the text and the context. Words should be taught and used in oral and written language. Again, both contexts, not just one in isolation from the other. So what are some classroom activities? You want to teach about the schwa. So read the first syllable, then notice how the vowel sounds get muffled and emptied when you read it again, and the second unaccented syllable in the 2-syllable word. Pen, happen. Establish awareness of the syllable and phonemes in words. Conclude how many syllables, where do you hear the schwa sound? Identify prefixes, roots, and suffixes. So taking a word and breaking it down, parsing it out into each piece. Define the affixed words. So the age suffix form nouns has many meanings. So acreage, usage, postage. So you're defining what those suffixes and affixes mean. Now think about how much this would have benefited you at the GRE level, or the SAT, or the ACT, or any of those types of standardized tests where it assumes that you have these skills to analyze those vocabulary words and derive meaning based on a word that you wouldn't have been exposed to, based on its roots, its suffixes, prefixes, and Latin and Greek roots. But I know I didn't get it in school, and I doubt you did either, unless you had Latin. I think one of you said that you did. Proofread and correct misspellings. So you proofread and say, okay, this is not the way it's spelled. So let's check that. Look into the dictionary, see how it's spelled, and the dictionary will have those word origins as well. You can practice word building with one root. So it has the root spect, in with spect, inspect, and this is very similar to what you did before with combining base words, prefixes, and suffixes, but you just have one root instead of many. You can build word webs or diagrams that show families of words built from a root. And the book has an excellent example of that. And then complete words in a closed passage or closed reading. And closed reading, that'll be discussed more when you're talking about literacy and how to improve literacy. But essentially, this is a good example. It is pos, and they have to fill it in, a bowl, and even probable that the dictionary saved Abel's deplorable life. So essentially, it took out all those suffixes and had the student fill it in for them. So it's important to know that mastery of derivational morphemes is influenced by the frequency words are encountered in text, the complexity of the derivational relationships that characterize words, and whether spelling is a clue to a word's structure, meaning, and origin. And it says Carol Chomsky, a huge linguistic influence in the field of speech-language pathology, observed that English orthography is morphophonemic rather than a phonetic transcription of speech, and suggested that derivational word relationships should be taught to school children. This was in 1970. And Motes closes, at last this advice should be heeded. And I completely agree. I mean, they need to know this, and they need to be taught this, but unfortunately it's still not happening. And we're, 40 years, more than 40 years from the time that she said that. So hopefully we'll eventually make that educational shift. Then on page 149, it has content domain types of instructional materials needed for teaching phoneme graphing correspondence, such as K through 1, and then the types of morphologic knowledge that you should be exposing to them as they grow in their grade levels and reading skills.